Okay, we'll start with this. This image was posted via the Instagram account of Eddie Hearn, and how there may be talks, progressive talks, of a super middleweight unification fight between the WBO champion, Zurdo Ramirez, and the Ring Magazine and WBA champion, Caleb Smith. And this encompasses a few things. This image encompasses a few things that I've mentioned in previous videos. How, yes, Eddie Hearn and Bob Arum, in many ways in the American market, they are competitors, they are rivals, but they're not bitter rivals, you understand. They still have a better working relationship with each other than, say, Al Heyman has with Bob Arum, or Al Heyman has with Eddie Hearn, or Al Heyman has with Oscar De La Hoya. You understand? That even though Eddie Hearn and Bob Arum, in some ways right now, are competitors, there's still enough of an amicable relationship there that certain fights can happen, because at the end of the day, the fight happening is more beneficial to everyone than the fight not happening is beneficial to anyone. It's a sport of boxing, ladies and gentlemen. You gotta do what you gotta do to make the big fights happen, because you don't benefit in any way from the fight not happening at all.
Neither do the fans.
Sometimes things get convoluted between commitments to networks and what have you, but at the end of the day, what's beneficial to the sport of boxing is the best versus the best, and Zurdo Ramirez just so happens to be one of the best guys in the super middleweight division, and the same can be said for Callum Smith. You know, Zurdo Ramirez right now, of all the world champions, he is the longest reigning world champion among them.
But even with that, it's still subject to debate whether or not he is the best super middleweight in the world. If he is the consensus #1 amongst the fans and the powers that be that rank these fighters, I mean, take into consideration that even though Zurdo Ramirez is the longest reigning champion of the 4 world champions in the super middleweight division, he's still ranked behind Callum Smith with both Ring Magazine, Transnational, and BoxRec, and only ESPN ranks Zurdo Ramirez as the #1 guy. In that way, it is still subject to debate, not just amongst the fans, but amongst the pundits as well. And the only real way to find out which one out of all these different world champions that got belts of their own, the only real way to find out which one among them is the best in show is for them to fight each other. Now, we're all familiar with the kind of hindrances that prevent these types of fights from happening, but this image here, and what could be preliminary talks for a unification fight, this encompasses what I was talking about, that yes, Bob and Eddie are rivals, so at times there's going to be banter, at times there's going to be promoter talk, but at the end of the day, they still have an amicable enough relationship to where these kinds of obstacles can be worked around. Can be worked around to give the fans the kinds of fights that they want to see. I mean, it could be a situation to where, you know what, Eddie might decide, you know, stateside, let ESPN have the rights for the fight, and then we'll reap the benefit in the UK from Sky. You know, it could be a situation like that. There are any variety of ways to slice and dice a situation like this to where the fight still comes off and both parties get what they want. Now, I imagine that this fight hinges on the atypical kinds of factors. Zurdo Ramirez is going to be back in action this weekend, and he's going to be back in action not as a super middleweight champion, but as a light heavyweight contender. Thing is, he's still got his WBO title in the super middleweight division, where we all thought, when he announced that he was going up to light heavyweight, that he was going to vacate it and it would be available for Billy Joe Saunders to fight for it. Guess not.
He decided to hang on to it. And because he decided to hang on to it, you can use your imagination as to how things could break down. That if he is successful this weekend in his light heavyweight contest, he may go back down to super middleweight for a Callum Smith fight, because that's the kind of money fight that he's been looking for, more or less. That would be one of the most relevant fights the division would have to offer. And in doing so, if he walked into a unification fight, that would effectively stall out Billy Joe Saunders should he beat Isufi and become the mandatory challenger to that belt. Because guess what? Unifications trump mandatories. So even if you do win that fight, you may not get it as quickly as you'd like. Run a bad luck for Billy Joe Saunders if it happens that way, but you know what? You had a title shot at the WBO via Demetrius Andrade. You know, that fight was on the table. You're the one that walked away from that to go up there playing at super middleweight, so you kind of, you know, shot yourself in the foot. It is what it is. I'll say, it's a bit too soon for a breakdown of what a Callum Smith versus Zurdo Ramirez fight might look like. these are preliminary images, thus they herald preliminary talks. There's plenty of there's plenty of room, I should say, for things to fall apart. And while I hope that doesn't happen, it is a bit too soon to break down the fight itself, because we don't even know that it's going to happen. All we can do at this stage is hope, but it does look promising. Because both Bob Arum and Eddie Hearn are men who are about town and about their business. And it behooves the both of them, for their fighters, what benefits their fighters, to make a fight like this. Because this is the kind of fight that the both of them need. They're not going to be able to make a name for themselves independent of each other. Those champions at super middleweight, they need to start fighting each other, because for fuck's sake, there's 4 of them. So, I like what I'm seeing here, and I reiterate, this is what I was talking about. Yeah, they're competitors, but they're more willing to work with each other than some others. And even though the market is very competitive right now, and it is. I mean, we saw what just took place with these same 2 guys.
Days ago.
These 2 same men of industry. We saw what just took place with them when it came to Vasyl Lomachenko and Anthony Crolla. Anthony Crolla being Loma's mandatory challenger. Eddie Hearn, he wanted to use that as an opportunity to push for a purse bid so the fight could end up on DAZN. And as a result of that, Bob Arum overpaid Anthony Crolla so that they could reach a deal to make sure that fight lands on ESPN. That's how competitive the market is right now. So don't lose sight of that. The market is competitive because everybody's got to keep up with the Joneses. Everybody's got to put out the best content they can. Those things in mind.
Yeah, it's competitive.
Even though the market is very competitive and that hasn't changed, when you have amicable relationships,
when you have them,
when you're rivals, but not bitter rivals, you understand. What situations can be worked around, usually are worked around. And I think that's more or less what we're seeing here with Zurdo Ramirez and Callum Smith. That if Bob and Eddie were really like bitter rivals, similar to how Bob and Al Heyman are more or less bitter rivals, then this fight wouldn't even be on the table. Wouldn't even be a conversation. But because Eddie and Bob, yeah, they're rivals, just not bitter rivals, it's still a possibility. What situations can be worked around will be worked around. The olive branch will be extended when there's wiggle room for compromise.
The plans are to have the fight in Russia. Frank Warren and Yarde have agreed to terms, and we're getting an appropriate date in June or July for that fight. But everything is a go, and an announcement will be made shortly.
So just to confirm, Yarde has agreed to take the fight in Russia?
That is my understanding, yes. I met with Kovalev's manager today, Igis Klimas, and Igis told me that Yarde had agreed to terms.
You might hear me say this from time to time on the channel, that boxing news is fluid. Boxing news is ever-changing. And things could look one way today and work out another way tomorrow. And that's more or less what's happening with the Anthony Yarde versus Sergey Kovalev mandated title fight. That a couple of days ago, to talk around the town, word around the campfire was that Team Yarde was asserting themselves as the A-side, that they wanted that fight to take place in London. They wanted to do the domestic thing, and they felt that that's the best place for the fight. To top that all off, Tunde of Team Yarde, Tunde Ayahi, he said that if they've got to come to America for that fight, then it ain't no fight. So as you can imagine, if that's what Team Yarde had to say in regards to fighting in America, then how would they feel about going over there to Russia, to Chelyabinsk, Russia, where Sergey Kovalev is from? You gotta remember what they said. They said they didn't want to,
Tunde
Ayahi cited the Tyson Fury versus Deontay Wilder fight and the scoring in that fight as the reason that they don't want to have it over here. That's what he said.
Not too long ago.
Essentially, what he was highlighting was partial scoring.
Yeah, I know.
Well, you can imagine that the scoring in Russia in regards to a Kovalev fight might be 10 times more partial, Those things in mind, it seemed like this was a demand that Team Yarde would not acquiesce to, that they wouldn't budge on that if you took issue with fighting in America than fighting with Russia, that might be out of the question. And yet, we're seeing the opposite. According to Bob Arum and his understanding of things, it's a go. They've got the green light. And the only thing that's left to do now is to make an official announcement. I'll tell you the truth, that even in light of this interview from Boxing Social, I maintain my skepticism. I maintain it because of how much back and forth
there has already been. I maintain it because of how counterintuitive it may seem to Team Yarde to put their guy in this situation, to allow him to go ahead with a fight like this, to step up in competition like this, when he really has yet to face a world-level opponent. This would be the most world-level guy he's faced, and right now, there is a massive question mark as to whether or not he's even ready for a fight like this. You haven't fought the likes of a fucking John Pascal or an Isaac Chilemba. So you go from Travis Reeves to Sergey Kovalev? Anybody can see how that might be counterintuitive. That at minimum, if your guy is ready, if he is, we haven't seen that yet. It's not his fault. He doesn't come from the same amateur background as a lot of guys in the light heavyweight division. Understandable. I'm not even knocking him for it. But what I am saying is, there really isn't any indication on Anthony Yarde's resume that he's prepared for a fight like this. And those things in mind...
I'm skeptical.
A fight like this? I could see why they would want to circumvent a fight like this. They could always turn around and tell Anthony Yarde, yes, you're passing up on a world title opportunity, but look at it this way. You're a young guy with your whole career ahead of you. You turn down one world title opportunity, and you could end up with another one just like it in a matter of months. I mean, there are any variety of ways to get out of this fight. And that's a part of the reason that I'm skeptical. That they could go and sign contracts. You know, they could sign the contracts, announce the date and the venue for the fight, all that jazz. But a fight can fall apart in a matter of days. You understand? That you go as far as signing contracts, you announce the fight, and then a couple of days before the fight, we hear that Anthony Yarde got injured in camp and he's not going to be able to participate in the fight. Something along those lines. That I'm not really going to believe it until I see it. And I don't mind being wrong. If they prove me wrong, then great. We get the fight. And I have no issue admitting it either. You know, I got no problem with it. I'm just saying that at this point in the juncture, given how everything has gone so far, I am a bit skeptical. I mean, if members of Anthony Yarde's team are sitting there on camera taking issue with flying to America to have a fight on the premise of partial scoring, then how the fuck are they going to feel about going over there to Russia, where the guy's actually from? So you'll excuse me if I'm skeptical right now. You'll excuse me if I won't believe it until I see it. But it's not about assigning blame. It's not about vilifying anyone. It's just that the way that the negotiations have gone so far, 1 minute there's progress, 1 minute it comes to a halt, 1 minute there's progress. I don't know. You know? Look at it this way. You know, the Demetrius Andrade versus Billy Joe Saunders fight, all systems were a go for that thing, and suddenly, oh, well, you know, Billy, he used some Flonase from over there in the UK, and it's legal over there, but it's not legal over here, so the fight's off. And we saw what happened with the Billy Joe Saunders and Martin Murray fight. That thing got canceled. And these were both fights where all systems were a go. That the fights were all but done as far as the paperwork and what have you. But at the end of the day, the fights didn't come off. That leading up to the fight, something happened, and the whole fucking thing got called off. So who's to say that that might not happen here, given the aforementioned factors? That one, might be too soon for Yarde to take on a fight like this. Two, they don't want to have a fight like this in the other guy's backyard. Three, the talks haven't been progressive throughout. I don't necessarily know that this is a fight that Anthony Yarde's team wants. Maybe he wants it because he's the fighter, but maybe they don't want that for him. It could be any variety of reasons, but the bottom line is that in spite of what Bob Arum is saying here to Boxing Social, I'm skeptical, and I won't believe it until I see it.
And their fights are getting no buzz. I'm going to tell you why their fights are getting no buzz, because he never came to us. We need $1 million now. We need $1 million. The LDVC, New Media, Black Media Row, we need $1 million to zone, and we can make your product hot. We need $1 million, at least. We need a 7-figure deal, because you're never going to be hot in the streets if you don't have the people in the streets. You can call out any other medium. You can do any other, you can reach out to anybody you want. And by all accounts, you've tried. You've flown out 20 media members, and you got nothing from it. You chose the wrong ones, obviously, right? Anthony Joshua is still not popular.
Now, having heard that soundbite, what Barbershop Hallucinations has effectively done is put his proverbial foot in his proverbial mouth. Because people have long suspected
that members of the LDBC, that members of the new media, and, just outliers like Fred or Barbershop Hallucinations, people have long suspected that the way that these guys deliver the news really isn't news at all, that it's propaganda. It's propaganda for the PBC, it's propaganda for Al Heyman, propaganda specifically in this instance for Deontay Wilder.
Not news.
And how the spread of this propaganda denotes that maybe these guys are part of a street team that's being paid to deliver the news that way. That really it's not news at all. And that these guys are on the payroll. Because here we see this middle-aged man saying that DAZN has to give him and his new media LDBC Dust Bunny buddies $1 million so that they can what? Do for DAZN what they've done for Wilder? And what have you done for Wilder? Think about it. Wilder's last fight was on pay-per-view, whereas his next fight is not. Wilder's purses are nowhere near what Anthony Joshua's purses are, and we cover that on a regular basis. I mean, that goes without saying that the pay gap between those two guys is about as big as the Grand Canyon.
Hello!
Mr. Barbershop Hallucinations, he's saying that he can provide those same services to DAZN so that he can help get the people on the street interested in DAZN when, you know what, you're acting like a person in the street. A homeless person on the street. I see two possible scenarios here. One scenario is that these quote-unquote members of the media aren't really members of the media at all, so much as they're members of a street team that's on the payroll. And what they're attempting to do is spread as much propaganda as they can to pull a veil over the boxing community's eyes for profit. That they're being paid to do that. They're being paid to lie to you. And what's worse is some of you morons actually want to be lied to. That's one scenario. The other scenario is maybe these guys aren't members of a street team, but they would like to be, and their services are for hire. That these middle-aged men in their late 30s or early 40s that normally panhandle on YouTube day to day with their little videos, their delusions of grandeur have gotten them to the point to where they're demanding $1 million. I can't tell you how truly just cringeworthy it is to see a man behaving this way, a man this age, regularly behaving this way on social media, having so many delusions of grandeur, just being so determined to be acknowledged that even if the acknowledgement comes with a negative connotation attached, he'll settle for it just so long as he's acknowledged. Because that's how determined he is to be in the spotlight. That in pursuit of fame, he will settle for infamy. Similar to what we see from Adrian Broner. Now that's the mindset of a person with a fragile ego, constantly seeking validation and acknowledgement to compensate for their inadequacies. Essentially, a beta male. That's what it looks like to me.